Good morning and welcome to Love Every Moment, coming to you today from Holbrook, Arizona at the Wigwam Hotel off of Route 66. Today's verse is 1 Peter 4:18. And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Well, this comes after last week's verse, and I had the link up here that says that there's going to be judgment first for God's church. We are going to be judged first. Of course, it's a very different judgment as simply the sins that we've committed after becoming a Christian simply get burned up with fire and we are left as pure refined gold. But with the sinners, well, it's a different story, and it's a lot worse. And so we have to have that compassion for them. Also, keep in mind the entire context that Peter has been driving up to this point, and that is we need to love to the point of sacrifice, to the point of suffering. And if we practice love such as hospitality, and we end up with a dirty house, or we end up with broken stuff, or we end up losing out some way or another, it's still for God's glory that we are suffering for the right reasons, the reasons of showing His love. Now, of course, Peter also said we could suffer for the wrong reasons, and that's not what we should be suffering for. Wrong reasons such as murder and theft and even being a nosy busybody. It doesn't bring God any glory if we are getting our nose into other people's business. In fact, if we're calling ourselves Christians and do that, we are taking the Lord's name in vain. So that's no good. We need to make sure we have that discipline. Now, today's verse says, if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved. So what's the difficulty? Well, it could be the fact that we're suffering and we are losing out from a human point of view. However, remember that in the actual salvation, we're not doing any work. Jesus does all the work of salvation through His sacrifice on the cross. I do zero to earn my salvation. Absolutely zero. I simply love Him more than anyone else or anything else. And I invite Him to take the driver's seat of my life, and He can steer, He can brake and put the gas on and fiddle with the radio and so forth, and it should be hands off for me. Yes, once in a while I will reach over and take the steering wheel or fiddle with the controls, and that is a sin. But again, those sins will be burned up, and He disciplines me, and it gets a little easier as I get to trust Him and the way He's driving. Now, with this all in mind, let's have an interesting look at a cross-reference. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is the famous verse about communion. It's often read whenever a church practices communion, as it talks about, here's how Jesus took the bread and the wine, etc. After that, it talks about, but make sure you do some self-introspection. You need to make sure you're not in a wrong relationship with God, because otherwise you take communion, you're eating and drinking condemnation unto yourself. With that in mind, let's pick it up in 1 Corinthians 11:30. It says, for this reason many among you are weak and sick, and a number sleep, which is a euphemism for death. So when we are Christians, we have invited Christ into our lives, and we are true Christians, there's going to be some discipline. Sometimes it involves making us weak, and some interpret that as being weak in society or weak in church society, positionally in other words, or sick, physically sick, or even being taken out of this life early, that if the Lord can't use us anymore because we're being so resistive, He might as well just take us up. Then, verse 31, but if we judged ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. Okay, keep that in mind. Verse 32, but when we are judged, we are disciplined by the Lord so that we will not be condemned along with the world. And that discipline, as you see, can be pretty difficult. And maybe that's what Peter's referring to when it says if we're saved with difficulty. But then think about non-Christians. They're going to have a much worse time of it. So let's have that love well up to compassion for others in our hearts and tell them the good news that they don't have to suffer like that. Because if we choose to love every moment, we're going to love every moment. I'm your average Rich, and I hope you have a great week.